Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to dive into a really fascinating question today. Why did two massive icons, who both battled the same demons, end up with such wildly different fates? The answer, it turns out, might have less to do with brain chemistry and a whole lot more to do with, well, physics. We're talking about the elastic mind.
Okay, so on one side you have Marilyn Monroe, the absolute picture of fragility, right? And on the other, Winston Churchill, the bulldog, the very definition of resilience. Both of them were just huge figures, but behind the scenes, both were fighting this private war with severe depression. And yet, one life just completely collapsed under the weight of it all, while the other, well, he led an entire nation through its darkest hour. So what gives? What was the difference?
The answer might not be what you think. It's not necessarily in their brain chemistry, but in its mechanics. Let's try something. For the next few minutes, let's stop thinking about the mind as this, soup of chemicals. Instead, let's picture it as a physical object, something that can bend and stretch and, eventually break under too much pressure.
And that's where this really cool idea comes in. It's called the Brain Kinematics Model. It completely reframes the question. It suggests we should look at mental health less like biology and more like engineering, with rules about elasticity, strain, and, breaking points.
Okay, so think of it this way. Every time you go through something stressful or emotionally tough and you don't fully process it or balance it out, it leaves something behind, like a tiny, invisible bit of emotional baggage. The model calls this residual strain. It's like the emotional echo that just kind of hangs around long after the event is over.
So how do we deal with all this strain building up? Well, our brain's main defense is something called visoelasticity. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but it basically just means mental bounciness. It's that amazing ability our minds have to stretch under pressure, like a rubber band, and then snap right back to its original shape once the pressure's off.
But, and this is the really critical part, what happens if too much of that strain builds up? Well, that mental bounciness, it starts to fade. The whole system gets weaker, and eventually the mind can get bent so far that it doesn't snap back. It gets stuck in that new, distorted shape. The model calls this plasticization, and it's what can lead to that chronic, just unshakable depression.
So this all leads to a really important question, right? If our mental health really does work like a physical system, is there some way to measure it? Can we get some kind of, a check engine light for our minds before a total breakdown happens?
Well, this model actually proposes a tool for that. It's called the Disturbance Index, or DI for short. And you can pretty much think of it like a dashboard for your mind. Something that could, in theory, track its stability and its resilience as you go. So what goes into this Disturbance Index? It really boils down to three key things. First is complexity. Basically, how rich and varied are your brain's signals? Then there's flexibility. How easily can you jump from one thought to another without getting stuck in a loop? And finally, plasticity. How good is your brain at learning and rewiring itself? A really healthy, resilient mind is going to score high on all three of these.
So all of those factors, they get combined into one single number, the flexibility score. And this, right here, is the key. It's a direct measure of your mind's power to bounce back from all that stress we talked about. A high score, you recover. A low score, you get stuck. It's kind of crazy to think that this one number could be the difference between just having a bad day and developing a chronic condition.
Okay, so let's put this into practice. Let's take a look at our first case study and see how this model can help us understand the tragic unraveling of Marilyn Monroe. We can actually use this framework to look back and analyze the forces that were at play in her life.
Her story really starts with a childhood that was just full of instability, which this model would say put her whole system at risk right from the get-go. Now, you might think fame would help, and it did provide a kind of balance for a little while. But it was super fragile, totally dependent on what other people thought. And here's a huge piece of the puzzle. Her increasing use of barbiturates literally reduced her brain's plasticity, its ability to adapt. So her mind's natural elasticity just kept getting weaker and weaker and weaker until it just failed.
And if you want to see it in a number, here it is. Her calculated flexibility score was around 0.05. It's practically zero. By the end of her life, her mind had just about zero ability to bounce back from anything. It was trapped, it was rigid, stuck.
Okay, now let's flip the coin. Let's contrast all of that with Winston Churchill. Here's a guy who wrestled with his own demons his entire life, and yet he somehow managed to lead a nation through its absolute darkest hour. How?
He famously called his depression his black dog. He described it as this constant, menacing companion that was always with him. And if you think about the strain he was under, I mean, personally, professionally, it was just immense. So the question is, why didn't his system collapse?
Well, the answer, according to this model, is something called protective motifs. See, unlike Monroe, whose sense of balance came from unstable, external things like fame, Churchill built up these powerful internal resources. Things like painting, writing, the release he got from giving speeches, and this really powerful, unshakable sense of his own destiny. All of these things acted like giant shock absorbers for his mind, helping him stay flexible and resilient no matter what. And again, look at the number, it tells the story. His flexibility score was consistently high, at or above 0.25. What that means is, even when that black dog was biting its hardest, his mind always had the power to bounce back.
So when you put them side by side like this, the difference between resilience and rigidity just becomes so incredibly clear. It really wasn't about who was suffering more, it was about who was better equipped to recover. This chart really lays it all out, doesn't it? Monroe's life started with this fragmented, unstable foundation, and she depended on things like fame and relationships to keep her balanced. Her flexibility score just tanked, which led to this rigid, chronic state. Churchill, on the other hand, yeah, he had a harsh childhood, but he built these anchored internal systems, his creativity, his sense of purpose, to balance the strain. And because of that, his flexibility score stayed high, which meant he could recover again and again.
So here it is, the big takeaway. Resilience is not about the absence of stress, it's about the presence of flexibility. It's not about managing to avoid the darkness in life. It's about building up your ability to always find a way back to the light.
And that just leaves us with this one final thought to chew on. Right now, this model is mostly a conceptual idea. But what if it wasn't? What would change if we could actually see these patterns in ourselves, in the people we care about? What if we could get a warning, not when we're feeling sad, but when we're starting to lose that ability to bounce back? What could we do if we could act before it's too late?